My name is Jennifer, and I need to share something that happened to my 2-year-old daughter Isabella exactly 1 week ago. I've been wrestling with whether or not to tell this story, but after much prayer and consideration, I feel compelled to share what she experienced during what the doctors called a traumatic head injury. The night of September 8th is carved into my soul, as if the air itself was branded with fire. You know those evenings when life feels ordinary, safe, predictable, when you're driving your child to a carnival and humming along to the radio? Never imagining that within a few hours, your entire existence will tilt into eternity's shadow? That was me. I dropped Isabella off at 6 o'clock sharp, reminded her twice to call me when she was ready, and kissed her forehead with a little laugh about her fearless appetite for roller coasters. I had no way of knowing that my words would soon be drowned out by the scream of sirens and the prayerful sobs of a mother clinging to hope. At 8:47 p.m., the phone rang, but it wasn't Isabella's playful voice. It was a paramedic, steady yet urgent, telling me there'd been an accident at the carnival. I froze, time itself fractured in that second. My heart felt like it was cracking open, each beat heavier than the last. You can almost hear the blood in your ears when panic takes over, a pounding drum that drowns out reason. I remember fumbling for my keys, whispering Jesus, 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 over and over again, like a lifeline. The scene when I arrived was chaos turned hollow. Lights flashing red and blue carved across the rides that had suddenly gone silent, their laughter replaced by stunned whispers and children crying. The Gravitron sat still, its metal frame towering like a coffin of steel, while Isabella lay on a stretcher, limp, blood tracing a line down from her temple. I tried to reach for her, but the paramedics held me back as they worked, checking vitals, securing straps, calling out medical terms I didn't understand. My soul wanted to scream, but my voice would not rise above a whisper. I could only say, "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." The ride operator's pale face was lit by the strobe of police flashlights, mumbling about inspections, safety harnesses, and impossibilities. But none of that mattered, not one technical detail mattered. What mattered was that my little girl, my fearless, bright-eyed child, lay motionless between life and eternity. Terror has a taste, did you know that? It is metallic, like blood in the mouth, and it fills your throat until every swallow becomes a battle. The ambulance swallowed us whole, and I rode beside her, my hands locked around her fingers, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. "You're going to make it, sweetheart. Jesus is here. He's with us." The machines beeped, the paramedics exchanged coded words, and I felt like I was floating outside my body, watching it all unfold. That's when I understood what so many people describe in their near-death experiences: life itself teeters on an invisible threshold, and everything ordinary becomes both fragile and infinite in the same breath. At the hospital, Dr. Rodriguez met us at the door. Grave eyes, firm voice, urgent orders. Brain swelling, severe trauma, critical surgery. I heard her words, but they fell into me like stones, into water heavy, muffled, sinking fast. We signed papers, prayed and trembling, and handed over our child to strangers wielding scalpels, trusting God to hold what no human could promise. 3 hours stretched into eternity in that waiting room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a cruel reminder that time still moved forward even when your heart begged it to stop. Family arrived, prayers lifted like incense, tears soaked into shoulders. And in those moments, you realize prayer isn't fancy or polished, it's raw breath. It's the desperate pounding of your spirit against heaven's gates. Finally, the doors opened, and Dr. Rodriguez emerged, her scrubs streaked, her face drained. "We relieved the pressure," she said. She made it through surgery. Relief surged, but it was laced with terror because her words carried a shadow. The next 48 hours would decide everything. Consciousness uncertain. Cognitive damage possible. Survival fragile. When they wheeled her into the pediatric ICU, I followed like a ghost, tethered to a body I barely recognized as mine. Machines surrounded her bed, wires tangled across her chest and arms, tubes trailing from her nose and mouth. Beeps pulsed in rhythm, like synthetic heartbeats echoing into the silence. My daughter, once a whirlwind of laughter and movement, now lay still as porcelain, her tiny hand cool beneath mine. For 63 minutes that night, I sat beside her, whispering every memory I could think of, weaving stories of vacations, birthdays, bedtime prayers, casting them into her silent world, like fishing lines. praying one might tug her back to me. The silence of her chest rising and falling mechanically was louder than any scream. Terror, that was the emotion that ruled me. Terror that no amount of control, no mother's love, no medical expertise could guarantee her return. Terror that perhaps I had kissed her forehead for the last time when I dropped her off at the carnival gates. Terror that whispered, "Prepare yourself, because she may never open her eyes again." And yet, even in that terror, there was one soft thread: prayer. In the cold, sterile room, with its white walls and blinking lights, I felt the faintest warmth of something unseen. You know it when you sense it. God bending close, unseen but undeniable, whispering in your trembling soul, "I am here." 63 minutes. That number carved itself into me like an invisible brand. While the doctors called it unconsciousness, I knew, deep in my spirit, it was something more, something sacred, mysterious, and terrifying all at once. I sat in that pediatric ICU with my hand wrapped around Isabella's, and the minutes trickled past like drops of eternity. Every tick of the clock seemed to mock me, daring me to keep believing, daring me to hold on to faith when the evidence around me whispered otherwise. The stillness of her small chest rising beneath the tubes, the relentless beeping of machines, the quiet shuffle of nurses in and out, it all blurred into a strange valley between life and death. You know that sense when you're caught between two worlds, like dreaming but awake, hearing but unable to move? That's where she was, and in a way, that's where I was too. The Valley of Shadows is not only for the dying, it's for those who love them, who wait, who pray, who sit in unbearable helplessness as the battle rages beyond their control. Helplessness is a heavy cloak. It smothers every ounce of strength, pressing down until you wonder if even your prayers are making it through the ceiling. I whispered her name. I sang her lullabies from when she was a baby. I prayed Psalm 23 aloud. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, my voice trembled, but my spirit clung to each word. Still, her eyelids did not flutter. Her lips did not move. She seemed locked away, wandering somewhere I could not follow. Later, she would tell me that she truly was wandering, slipping out of her fragile body, standing outside herself, watching doctors lean over her with instruments and frantic movements. She described the sensation as if she had been lifted gently by invisible hands, floating above her own stretcher, hearing words she couldn't fully understand, but feeling no pain. Time itself bent and stretched, no longer moving in seconds but in waves of light and darkness. At the 30-minute mark, the ICU clock glowing in cold blue numbers, I felt the air in the room shift. It's hard to describe, but it was as though the atmosphere itself grew thicker, like heaven leaned closer. My skin prickled, and I held my breath. Even then, before I knew what Isabella was seeing, I sensed the veil between worlds was thinner than paper. She would later recount that she entered a tunnel of shadow, not dark like night, but heavy like fog. A boundary stretched ahead, one she instinctively knew could not be crossed, unless it was truly her time. She told me she saw figures lingering in those dim corridors, some reaching out with longing, others crouched in fear, waiting for something they didn't understand. She walked past them, her small bare feet gliding soundlessly on nothingness. And then light. Not just a flicker, not a glow, but a radiance so consuming it seemed to pour through every fiber of her being. Meanwhile, I sat gripping her hand, whispering over and over, "Come back, baby girl, come back to me." My helplessness deepened with each passing minute, but strangely, so did my determination. Isn't it odd how both despair and faith can live in the same breath? You feel crushed, yet you refuse to release hope. That's what kept me going during those 63 minutes. Nurses came and went, adjusting monitors, speaking in hushed tones that weren't meant for my ears. They had learned long ago how to guard their faces, how to hide fear behind professionalism. But I caught glimpses, furtive glances, subtle shakes of heads. They were preparing me to lose her. Yet in my spirit, I kept hearing a whisper. Hold on. Just hold on. Helplessness doesn't have to be the end of faith. It can be the doorway to surrender. And in that valley of shadows, as the seconds bled into minutes and the minutes bled into more than an hour, I surrendered everything. My fear, my control, my desperate attempts to bargain. I laid them down and whispered into Isabella's still ear, "Jesus, she's yours more than mine." That surrender burned like fire, but it also brought a strange calm. Because when you finally admit you cannot carry it anymore, you feel the weight shift. And though I didn't see what Isabella was seeing, I believe with every fiber of my being that at that very moment she was meeting the one I was whispering to. Tidbit, etched into eternity. She was gone from us, in every earthly sense, for exactly 63 minutes. To the doctors, it was unconsciousness. To me, it was the longest wait of my life. To her, it was the crossing of a threshold, a journey into the realm of mystery, where Jesus himself waited. At 2:15 inches the morning, everything shifted. I was half asleep in the hard ICU chair, my body stiff from hours of holding still, my spirit raw from the battle of prayer. Then, without warning, Isabella's eyes snapped open. Not the groggy flutter the doctors had warned me to expect, not the confused blinking of someone waking from sedation, but clear, sharp, immediate, as if she had simply chosen that very second to return. I gasped so loud the nurse rushed over, thinking something was wrong, but it was the opposite. My daughter's eyes were alive, and I knew instantly that she was not the same child I had kissed goodbye at the carnival gates. Her gaze held me, and it was not the mischievous sparkle of a 1-2-year-old who loved roller coasters and cotton candy. It was something ancient, something deep, like a well of water that had been hidden until that moment. Have you ever looked into someone's eyes and felt they were carrying more than their years, as though eternity itself was peering through? That's what I saw in Isabella. My heart skipped with both awe and fear. The nurses scrambled to check monitors, their voices urgent but tinged with amazement. The machines confirmed what their eyes already told them. Her vitals were strong, her breathing steady, her brain activity surprisingly stable. They called it miraculous, though few would dare to say that word aloud in a hospital hallway. But I knew. In my bones, in my trembling hands, I knew. The main emotion in that room was awe. Awe that shattered terror. Awe that replaced helplessness with a hush so holy it felt like stepping into a sanctuary. Even Dr. Rodriguez, stern and seasoned, paused when she entered. Her brows furrowed, but I saw the flicker of something softer in her eyes, something she couldn't quite rationalize. Medical textbooks didn't prepare anyone for this kind of recovery. In the days that followed, awe turned to astonishment. The doctors predicted long rehabilitation, weeks or months before Isabella could walk without stumbling, speak without slurring, remember without confusion. Yet within 72 hours, she was speaking clearly, moving freely, and showing none of the impairment they had prepared us for. It was as if her brain had skipped the stages of trauma and leapt into restoration. But with that healing came a transformation that unsettled me. My vibrant, outgoing girl, who used to chatter endlessly about friends and school and carnival rides, grew quiet. She stared out her bedroom window for hours, not watching anything in particular, but gazing as though she could see something beyond what the rest of us could. Her laughter was rare, replaced by moments of stillness that felt weighty, purposeful. Tidbit. Her recovery wasn't just physical, it was impossibly swift, beyond medical reason, and it carried with it a spiritual shift that no MRI could capture. At night, I would find her reading her Bible with a focus that startled me. The pages of Revelation caught her most often, her little fingers tracing lines as if she were following instructions, not just stories. Sometimes I'd ask what she was searching for, and she would only whisper, "I need to understand what's coming." That was when I knew. My daughter had brought something back with her from those 63 minutes. Awe was the current that carried us through those first days. Awe at the healing. Awe at the change in her eyes. Awe at the sense that our home was no longer just a home, but a threshold between heaven's secrets and earth's ordinary days. And yet, beneath the awe, a question pulsed in my chest. What had she seen? She wasn't ready to tell me yet, not fully. She just carried that depth in her gaze, that weight in her silence. But I could feel it. I could almost hear it in the air around her, as though her very presence hummed with eternity's echoes. When you encounter awe like that, you stop questioning whether miracles are real. You know. And once you know, you can never go back. The shift in Isabella's spirit was impossible to ignore. Once, she had been a whirlwind of chatter, telling me about her friends, what she wanted for dinner, the next roller coaster she was determined to conquer. But after the accident, silence became her companion. Not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the kind that feels full, weighted with secrets, drenched in mystery. She would sit by her bedroom window for hours, her chin resting on her knees, gazing at nothing my eyes could see. And when I asked her what she was thinking about, she would only murmur, "Forever." Curiosity began to stir in me. Not the shallow curiosity of gossip, but the deep yearning to understand what she had touched during those 63 minutes. There was wisdom in her eyes that hadn't been there before, as if she'd walked through centuries in a single hour. And I knew from the way she carried herself, quiet, contemplative, almost watchful, that my child had glimpsed a reality that most of us only wonder about in late-night prayers. She began to ask questions that startled me. Questions no 12-year-old should be able to form. "Mama, why do people waste so much time on things that don't last? Why are we so afraid of dying if heaven is real? What will happen when God says the world is finished?" Each one struck me like lightning, cracking open the places in my own heart where I had tucked away fears and doubts. I would try to answer, but more often I found myself simply holding her hand, whispering, "What do you think?" And that's when she began turning the pages of her Bible late into the night. Not casually, not like a child half-heartedly reading homework. She studied, line by line, tracing her finger over passages in Revelation and Daniel, her brow furrowed in concentration. I once peeked into her room near midnight and saw her lips moving silently, as if repeating words to etch them into her soul. She didn't notice me. Her face was lit by the lamp, but her expression seemed illuminated by something else entirely. Something unseen. The tidbit here is simple but profound. She dove into scripture with a hunger that outpaced her years, especially the prophetic books. It was as if her heart knew that what she had witnessed during those 63 minutes connected to the warnings and promises written thousands of years ago. Emotion curiosity saturated those days. Curiosity for her questions, curiosity for her silence, curiosity for the unseen weight she carried in her small shoulders. I began journaling everything she said, every shift in her behavior, as though collecting fragments of a puzzle I couldn't yet solve. One afternoon, I found her in the backyard sitting cross-legged in the grass, staring at the sky. I asked her what she was doing, and she replied in that hushed tone that carried more authority than any child's voice should. "I'm listening." Sometimes heaven speaks without words. The air around her seemed stiller, as if creation itself leaned in to hear. I wanted to dismiss it as imagination, the way adults often do with children, but something in me knew better. This wasn't play. This was preparation. When she finally started to hint at what she had seen, her words trembled with weight. She said she had been in the most beautiful place imaginable, a realm of light and peace that made earthly beauty look like shadows. She spoke of meeting someone there, not the gentle figure from Sunday school pictures, but Jesus himself, radiant and commanding, the King of Kings. She didn't go into details that day. She only pressed her hand against her chest and whispered, "Mama," he spoke here, tapping over her heart. I knew the time was coming when she would reveal everything, but even her hints sent shivers through me. For now, curiosity ruled. Curiosity in her eyes, curiosity in my heart, curiosity in the air of our home that seemed charged with expectancy. And I began to wonder if God himself was drawing me in, preparing me for revelations I never expected to hear from the lips of my 12-year-old daughter. The day came when Isabella finally opened the door to the secret she had been carrying. It wasn't in a dramatic burst, no sudden announcement or trembling declaration. It was quiet, almost like a confession whispered between eternity and earth. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the late afternoon light spilling through the curtains, when she looked at me with those eyes that had grown too deep for her age. She said, "Mama, I need to tell you what happened when I was gone." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she folded them together. I leaned in, my own heart pounding with anticipation and fear. For weeks, I had been sensing that she was carrying something heavy, something holy. Now, she was ready to release it. She told me that after leaving her body, after drifting past that shadowed tunnel filled with lost figures, she entered a place of brilliance so pure it seemed alive. It wasn't just light, she explained. It was love. The light itself felt like it knew me. She described colors she couldn't name, sounds that didn't enter through her ears, but resonated through her whole being, tones that vibrated with peace, with joy, with acceptance. And then Jesus. Not the picture book Jesus she had seen in Sunday school classrooms, gentle and smiling. No, she saw him as King of Kings. Radiant, powerful, majestic beyond words, yet overflowing with compassion that melted every fear. I couldn't look away. she whispered. It was like his eyes were fire and comfort at the same time. The awe in her retelling was unmistakable. And awe filled me too, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I realized I wasn't just listening to my daughter recount a dream. I was hearing testimony from someone who had stood in the presence of the eternal. She said he didn't use words the way we do. He spoke directly into her spirit, bypassing sound altogether. Thoughts, images, and visions flowed into her like rivers. She called it a download, though I knew it was something far beyond technology. It was spirit-to-spirit communication, perfect and undeniable. Tidbit: Jesus spoke without words, spirit to spirit, placing visions and truths directly into her being. That detail struck me like a bell, resonating with what I had read in accounts of others who had brushed against eternity. Isabella told me she felt both terrified and comforted at once. Terrified by his sheer holiness, comforted by his boundless love. I wanted to fall on my face, she said. But at the same time, I felt lifted up like I was his daughter, safe and known. Imagine being 12 years old and speaking words like that. My hands shook as I held hers, realizing that my child had seen what prophets longed to behold. She described visions that came in waves, scenes of earth shrouded in darkness, people crying out, angels standing guard, demons unleashed. But at the center of it all was Jesus, radiant and unshaken, commanding with authority that brooked no opposition. She said, his presence was like a fortress of fire around her, and though what she saw was terrifying, she never felt unsafe. Reverence, that was the emotion etched into every word, every pause, every breath of her story. Reverence so thick it hushed me. I didn't dare interrupt. I barely dared to breathe. I only listened, feeling as though heaven itself had bent low into our kitchen. As she spoke, I realized she was not just my daughter anymore. She was a messenger, a vessel of something so much greater than either of us. And the weight of that realization both humbled me and frightened me. When she finally fell silent, her eyes still glowing with that otherworldly light, I knew nothing in our lives would ever be the same. She had met Jesus. She had carried back his message. And now, the task of hearing, believing, and preparing had fallen to us. When Isabella finally revealed the heart of her vision, the atmosphere in our home shifted forever. She sat across from me, her small shoulders squared with an authority that didn't belong to childhood. Her voice lowered, and her words pressed into me like waves of urgency. "Mama," she said, "Jesus told me something is coming. The whole earth will face it. It will be the 3 days of darkness." I froze. I had heard whispers of that prophecy before, but never gave it more than a passing thought. Now my 12-year-old, who had just returned from the edge of eternity, was speaking it with conviction that left no room for doubt. She described it in detail, how the world would be plunged into a supernatural night, not an ordinary eclipse, not a blackout of power lines, but a blanket of spiritual darkness so thick no human light could pierce it. She saw cities silenced, skyscrapers swallowed in black, the hum of electricity gone, as even battery-powered devices failed. "Only candles will work," she said softly. "White, unscented candles. And oil lamps with pure oil." The tidbit struck me deeply. The instruction was exact. White and unscented, oil refined. These weren't random details. They were marks of preparation. But the physical darkness, Isabella explained, was only the beginning. Far more terrifying was what moved within it. She said Jesus showed her how, during those days, demons long restrained would be released to roam freely. Their goal would be to terrorize, deceive, and destroy anyone unprotected by faith. She heard voices in the darkness mocking, pleading, imitating the tones of loved ones, neighbors, friends, even family members. They would call from outside the doors, crying for help, urging people to open up, but it would all be lies. "Mama," she warned, her young face solemn, "no matter how real it sounds, no one must look outside, and no one must open the door." Fear mingled with urgency in my chest. Fear at the thought of such horror, urgency to cling to every word as though it were a map through disaster. She said Jesus promised his angels would guard the homes of the faithful, forming invisible walls of light to shield those who obeyed. But obedience was critical. Those who treated it lightly, who scoffed, who thought their half-hearted faith was enough, they would be vulnerable. She spoke of families huddled in candlelight, praying, worshiping, refusing to be lured by the sounds outside, and she said she saw angelic legions surrounding those homes, their presence fierce and unyielding, swords like fire drawn against the swarming darkness. Yet, even so, there were houses where the angels did not stand, places where faith had been replaced with compromise. The emotion coursing through me as she spoke was fear mixed with urgency. Not paralyzing fear, but the kind that wakes you up in the middle of the night, forcing you to take action. Urgency that whispered, "Prepare now, because waiting until later will be too late." She told me Jesus gave a clear timeline that there would be signs leading up to the darkness. Signs in the skies, tremors in the earth, dreams given to children. But when the final moment came, when the world plunged into silence and blackness, those prepared would be kept, and those unprepared would fall. As Isabella's words filled the room, I realized this wasn't just a child recounting a strange vision. This was a trumpet blast, a warning to mankind, a summons for repentance. The 3 days of darkness weren't distant, symbolic metaphors. They were near, precise, appointed. And through my daughter, Jesus was calling us to believe, to obey, to prepare. The candles, the oil, the sealed windows, these were practical steps. But the greater preparation was spiritual. Faith had to be real. Hearts had to be surrendered. Lives had to be cleansed of compromise. Isabella said it with a weight beyond her years. Those who trust in Jesus will be safe. Those who don't, will not. And in that moment, I felt both fear and hope wrestling inside me. Fear of what was coming, hope that God was giving us a chance to prepare. The warning about the darkness did not stand alone. Isabella spoke of stages, signposts that would unfold before the final plunge. Her eyes grew serious as she described them, her voice steady though she was only 12. She said the first stage would arrive in late September, around the 28th, when the skies themselves would begin to speak. Strange lights would flicker in places where no northern lights had ever been seen. Colors, greens, purples, even crimson streaks would ripple across the heavens, leaving scientists fumbling for explanations. Earthquakes would tremble in multiple places at once, not catastrophic but unsettling, as if the ground were groaning in anticipation. That detail etched itself into me. The earth would shudder, not to destroy, but to warn. Tidbit for this section: moderate tremors would occur simultaneously across nations, unsettling hearts and stirring questions. The main emotion in those days would be anticipation, Isabella said. Not the joyful kind, but a tense, watchful waiting. Like when you know a storm is gathering just beyond the horizon. People would sense something was off, but many would distract themselves with explanations. Climate change, solar flares, atmospheric anomalies. Only those listening for heaven's voice would recognize them as signs. She said children especially would begin to dream vividly. Little ones would speak of visions, animals behaving strangely, pets pacing restlessly, birds migrating in odd directions, wild creatures abandoning their territories. But most adults will laugh at them, Isabella whispered, her small hands folded tightly. They'll say it's imagination, or stress. But the children will be telling the truth. Then her voice dropped lower when she described the next marker. October 18th. She said that day would ignite something global, a wave of undeniable signs. The strange lights would intensify, appearing even in daylight. Massive solar flares would burst from the sun, disrupting satellites, interrupting broadcasts, throwing GPS systems into chaos. Weather would swing wildly: heat, then sudden cold, storms birthing out of nowhere. And in the middle of this chaos, she said, the Spirit of God would move like fire. Churches that had been empty would overflow. People who had once scoffed at prayer would find themselves weeping at altars. Ministers who had preached easy comfort would either be consumed with prophetic fire or exposed as frauds. This will be the last great awakening, Isabella told me, her eyes glistening, the last wide door before things move too fast. The urgency in her tone pressed deep into me. She was describing not just chaos, but opportunity. A moment when hearts would soften, when people would return to God in droves. But she also warned that it would be short. Mama, she said, October is the time to decide. After that, there won't be time for big movements or revivals. Families will have to be ready on their own. The anticipation this section carried weighed heavy in my spirit. It wasn't passive waiting, it was the kind of anticipation that calls you to move, to prepare, to search your own heart. I began to see that every detail Jesus had given Isabella wasn't meant to terrify us, but to wake us, to stir the sleepy, to prepare the faithful. And as her words settled over me, I couldn't help but tremble. September's trembling earth, October's fiery skies. The last chance for a world to repent. All of it moving like clockwork toward a December unlike any other in history. When Isabella's voice turned toward December, her tone grew heavier, like the weight of the month itself pressed on her words. She said the final stage before the darkness would begin around December 3rd, and the signs would be impossible to ignore. "Mama," she whispered, "it will look like a second sun in the sky." Her eyes grew distant as she described it, an immense celestial body approaching, visible both day and night. Not a star twinkling faintly, but a disk so large it would eclipse portions of the real sun at odd hours, casting eerie twilight across the world. Scientists would scramble for explanations, an asteroid, a rogue planet, but they would not agree on what it was or how it moved. What terrified me most was the way she said people would feel its presence before they fully saw it. Compass needles would spin. Auroras would ignite in skies everywhere. Deep purples, crimson waves, colors never before seen. The atmosphere itself would tremble. The tidbit that pierced me most, December 21st, the winter solstice, was the appointed moment. The earth itself would groan, and the world would plunge into darkness. That date was etched into her vision like a bell, tolling across eternity. The emotion here was alarm, rising sharp and unrelenting. Not the shallow alarm of a fire drill, but the kind that grips your chest when you know the house is truly burning. Isabella said December would bring supernatural manifestations everywhere. People would see angels openly, some radiant with fire, others holding back floods of demonic forces straining at the veil. Genuine miracles would break out among believers, healings, visions, supernatural provision. But alongside them, persecution would sharpen. "Mama," she said softly, "governments will try to silence it. They will say it's dangerous, that people like us are spreading fear. Authorities, both political and religious, would label prophetic warnings as hysteria. Many would be arrested, silenced, mocked." I felt my stomach twist as she described believers pressed into hiding, families gathering in secret to pray, children speaking prophecies, while their parents wept. The Spirit of God would roar like a lion, but the world would gnash its teeth in rebellion, and still, the signs would multiply. By mid-December, Isabella saw the approaching body blotting out part of the sun in broad daylight. Temperatures swung erratically, summer heat in the morning, freezing winds by afternoon. Seas began to churn unnaturally, whirlpools appearing in deep waters, dolphins beaching themselves, whales crying out in confusion. Earthquakes rumbled in unison across continents, not to devastate, but to shout one final warning. She said, "On December 18th, the earth itself will groan. People everywhere will hear it." That phrase lodged inside me. The earth itself will groan. Not just tremors, not just storms, but a global sound like creation crying out under the weight of what was coming. Alarm pulsed in me as she spoke. Not the kind that leaves you hopeless, but the kind that forces you to action. Alarm that drives you to your knees. Alarm that makes you seal your windows, stock your oil, prepare your heart. I realized then that December would not just be the month of alarms, it would be the doorway. On the solstice, the veil would rip wide open, and humanity would step into a darkness it had never known. And though my heart shook at the thought, I also felt God's mercy that He had sent the warning early, through the lips of my 12-year-old, so that we could prepare. The night of December 21st loomed in Isabella's vision like a storm cloud pregnant with thunder. She said it happened suddenly, though the world had been warned for weeks. The sun rose as usual that morning, pale and uneasy behind the strange celestial body. People went about their routines, nervous but unprepared, clinging to explanations that this was some rare astronomical fluke. And then, without warning, the light was gone. She said the darkness was absolute. Not like night, not like a blackout. This was thick, suffocating, impenetrable. Street lamps did not flicker on. Flashlights did not cut through it. Even battery-powered lanterns sat useless. The only glow that endured came from simple flames, candles, oil lamps, wood fires, white, unscented candles, just as Jesus had told her. That detail became sacred, a sign of obedience amid chaos. The tidbit Isabella pressed on me again and again. Only flames would shine, and even then, their light would feel fragile, swallowed at the edges by a darkness that was not natural but supernatural. The emotion she carried as she described it was shock, trembling, awe, mixed with holy fear. Her words painted scenes that chilled me. People screaming in the distance, voices outside homes calling out for help. The voices sounded like relatives, neighbors, even authority figures. Yet every one of them was false. "Mama," she said, gripping my hand tight. "They're demons pretending. If anyone opens the door, if anyone looks outside, they will be lost." She saw angels too, warriors blazing with fire, stationed at the doorways of homes that honored the warning. Invisible to unbelievers, but clear as daylight to her spirit, these angels stood as sentries, impenetrable walls of God's defense. She said the demons clawed and shrieked, but the angels never moved, their swords of flame cutting back the darkness. Then came the most terrifying and most glorious part of her vision. On the second night, the cemeteries themselves erupted. She saw the earth quake as graves split wide, not in destruction but in resurrection. Millions upon millions of bodies, the righteous of every generation, transformed in an instant into glorified beings. The very air shook with the power of it. And not only the dead. She said she watched as living believers were changed, ordinary men and women suddenly radiant, their mortal frames swallowed in incorruption. Disease vanished, weakness dissolved. Their eyes blazed with light. She said it was as if heaven clothed them in immortality right before her. "It was beautiful, Mama," she whispered, "but also terrifying, because not everyone who called themselves Christian was changed. Some were left behind, crying in anguish." Shock seared through me, as she explained. She saw churchgoers, pew-sitters, even pastors who had lived with double hearts, lukewarm, compromised, left trembling in fear as others around them were transformed. The separation was clear, final, irreversible. For 72 hours, the world trembled under that blanket of darkness. The sounds outside wailing, shrieking, battles in the skies were unbearable. And yet, within the homes of the faithful, a strange peace pulsed. Candles flickered, prayers rose, angels stood guard. The terror was real, but so was the triumph. Shock that was the current flowing through every part of her account. Shock at the terror of demons roaming free. Shock at the resurrection that shattered cemeteries worldwide. Shock at the sight of mortals becoming immortal in the twinkling of an eye. It was a vision both dreadful and glorious, a collision of judgment and mercy. And as Isabella spoke, my own heart shook with the same trembling. For what she described was not just a story. It was a glimpse of the day when God's line would be drawn, and eternity would break into time with power unstoppable. When Isabella described the morning after, her voice carried both relief and sorrow. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the darkness ended as suddenly as it had begun. She said the sun rose, pouring its warmth back across the earth. Yet the world it touched was not the same. Silence covered cities, interrupted only by cries of grief and confusion. Millions of people had vanished, the resurrected dead and the transformed living. Their clothes remained in beds, cars, workplaces, folded in eerie stillness. Airplanes landed without pilots, buses stalled without drivers, homes left half empty. The earth was awake again, but it was fractured. The tidbit she repeated over and over. Governments would not tell the truth. Within hours, leaders and media outlets offered an explanation: aliens. They would claim advanced extraterrestrials had removed select humans, rescuing them for safety. The lie would spread like wildfire, soothing the terrified and deceiving the desperate. Yet those who knew Scripture would recognize it instantly. The deception had begun. The emotion in her voice was a sober warning. No more anticipation, no more shock. This was heavy, steady, certain. A warning that clung to my spirit like iron. She said in the months that followed, a new order would rise. Charismatic leaders would emerge, promising safety, order, and progress. They would unite nations under a global government, using fear of another catastrophe as leverage. With them came technology tools that restored power grids, revived communication, and dazzled the masses. But Isabella knew the truth. These were not gifts from benevolent aliens. They were snares. The so-called technology was demonic in disguise, designed to bind humanity in chains of dependency. She said a mandatory identification system would appear, first as protection, then as necessity. Without it, people couldn't buy or sell, couldn't work or eat. Eventually, this system would evolve into the very mark of the beast foretold in Revelation. "Mama," she whispered, her eyes wet with grief, Those who miss the transformation will face the hardest choice, to bow to the beast or to die for Jesus. I felt my chest ache as she described believers left behind, people who once sat in pews, sang hymns, even preached sermons. Now, they would face persecution, imprisonment, execution. Many would finally surrender their lives fully to Christ, refusing the mark even when it cost them everything. Their blood would be the last harvest, their testimony seeds for a final revival before the end. Sober warning, that was the thread of part 10. A warning that time is short. A warning that deception will be strong. A warning that faith cannot be lukewarm. And as she finished speaking, her small shoulders shaking, I realized what had changed in her eyes since the accident. She had seen not only Jesus, but the unfolding of mankind's destiny. She had carried back the burden of a prophet, and that burden had now become mine too, not to hide, not to dismiss, but to proclaim. We stood together in silence that day, mother and daughter, both trembling beneath the same truth. The 3 days of darkness were not a story, not a legend. They were coming. And the world had precious little time left to prepare. Even now, as I recount Isabella's vision, I feel the weight of her words pressing into my spirit. It would be easy to dismiss them, to file them away as the product of trauma or imagination. But I can't. Not when I saw the change in her eyes. Not when I heard the details so precise, so consistent, so urgent. Not when I sensed the Holy Spirit confirming, deep within me, that this message is not for curiosity, it is for preparation. Slow down for a moment. Breathe. Picture your home lit only by a flickering candle. Outside, voices call your name, but you know they are not who they pretend to be. Inside, your family huddles close, praying, singing, trusting. Angels surround you, unseen but real. For 72 hours, the world outside crumbles, but inside, the presence of God holds you fast. That is the mercy of Jesus, that even in judgment, he makes a way for his children. So let this not be a tale that frightens you, but one that awakens you. Examine your heart. Ask yourself, am I ready? Am I living with a faith that is real, surrendered, whole? Or am I clinging to lukewarm habits that will not endure the fire? The time for casual Christianity is over. The time for choosing Jesus with everything you are has arrived. And now, my friend, if these words stir something in you, do not wait. Bend your heart before God. Call on the name of Jesus. Prepare both your home and your spirit. Because hope is not gone, it is burning brighter than ever. If these words resonate with you, leave an amen in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and share it with at least 3 friends or family members right now. Now is your time to make a difference. Spreading this message is not only an act of love, but also a mission that Jesus himself has entrusted to you.